In the heart of Tokyo, buried among the dense tangle of narrow streets, stood a decaying apartment building. Silent, forgotten, as though it had been swallowed by time. The tenants who lived there were ghosts of their former selves, but none were more invisible than Kazuki. 28 years old, Kazuki had retreated into his one-room apartment 3 years ago, sealing himself from the world in a life of endless isolation. A Hikikomori, a shut-in. Hidden away from the chaos outside, he let the world forget him as he spent his days in the glow of his screen, surrounded by filth and the detritus of his own life. The room was a shrine to decay, filled with rotting takeout boxes, crumpled soda cans, and the occasional scuttling of a cockroach seeking refuge. Kazuki had long stopped caring. His connection to reality had withered, replaced by endless streams of forums, obscure chat rooms, and videos he consumed with feverish obsession. Online, he was not Kazuki, but Ryo, a nameless entity with opinions that mattered, theories that spiraled into dark places, and anger that bubbled with nowhere to go. In the digital world, he had found others like him, disillusioned, invisible, waiting. It was in one of these dark corners of the internet where Kazuki first encountered Itako. A username as enigmatic as the person behind it, and their conversations started out innocuously enough. Discussions about isolation, about feeling forgotten by society, rejected by the world. But Itako's words were different. They carried a sense of power, a hidden understanding that Kazuki could not ignore. He was drawn in, spellbound by the way they could articulate the hollow feeling gnawing at his insides. Itako didn't just see the world as a broken machine. They spoke of ways to dismantle it entirely. "You're not alone," Itako had typed one night, the words flickering on Kazuki's screen like an incantation. "There are others like you. We don't have to live in this cage." Kazuki's pulse quickened, the idea burrowing into his mind. He was wary of feeling powerless, of being locked away, forgotten. The words lingered in his thoughts, even as he tried to sleep, filling his dreams with the twisted images of escaping. One morning, as the dim light of the sun barely pushed through the grime-streaked window, Kazuki awoke to a message from Itako. "Meet me." The message was jarring, almost impossible to comprehend. Meet? In person? Kazuki hadn't left his apartment in over 3 years. The very thought of stepping outside, of exposing himself to the judgmental gazes of society, paralyzed him. But Itako's message burned in his mind. More than a command. It was a lifeline. His curiosity, perhaps tinged with a desperate hunger for connection, drove him to act. That afternoon, he shuffled to the door, his hand trembling as he wrapped his fingers around the doorknob. The world beyond was a foreign, terrifying place. But something inside him, whether it was the promise of meaning, the allure of freedom, or a seed of madness, pushed him forward. He stepped outside for the first time in years. The streets felt alive with menace. Kazuki's heart raced as he slipped through the alleyways, avoiding eye contact. His head hung low. He had no destination, only a cryptic address sent by Itako. As he investigated deeper into the city, the familiar hum of Tokyo morphed into something alien, its usual bustling rhythm distorted. He could feel eyes on him, eyes that weren't there, whispers behind him that didn't exist. Finally, Kazuki arrived at an abandoned, crumbling warehouse on the outskirts of the city. The air was thick with a damp, musty odor, the walls coated in grime and forgotten graffiti. Inside, he found a single dim light flickering in the corner, casting long skeletal shadows across the room. And there, standing in the darkened space, was a figure cloaked in black. Itako. Kazuki's breath caught in his throat. They stood silently, watching him. There was no warmth in the way they regarded him, no comfort. But there was something else, something far more intoxicating. Power. Itako moved closer, their face obscured by a dark hood, with only their eyes visible, glinting in the faint light. "You've made the first step," they whispered, their voice smooth as velvet but cold as winter air. "Now, do you want to escape?" Kazuki nodded, unable to find his voice. Itako smiled, though it wasn't a smile of kindness. It was predatory. "Then you know what needs to be done." Kazuki didn't know, not fully. but he could feel it. It was an unspoken agreement, an understanding that had taken root deep inside him ever since their conversations began. The world was broken. Society had left him behind, chewed them up, and even spat them out. And now, it was time to make them pay. Weeks passed, and Kazuki's descent into madness quickened. Itako guided him further, leading him into dark acts, small at first. Petty theft, vandalism, things that made Kazuki feel powerful for the first time in years. The more he did, the more he craved the feeling of control. It was as though he was clawing his way back into existence, his rage feeding off the silence of his former isolation. But it didn't stop there. One night, under Itako's command, Kazuki found himself standing in front of a small, unsuspecting convenience store. The streets were quiet, the city asleep. He was armed with an old, rusted kitchen knife that had once been used for the mundane act of cutting vegetables. Now trembling in his grip, a symbol of something far darker. "Go inside." Itako's voice buzzed through his earpiece, their tone eerily calm. "Make them notice you." Kazuki's mind was a storm of thoughts, fear, exhilaration, anger. He stepped inside. The fluorescent lights above flickering, casting the store in a sickly, sterile glow. The clerk, a middle-aged man with weary eyes, looked up briefly, offering a tired nod before returning to his register. He had no idea. Kazuki approached the counter slowly, his fingers tightened around the handle of the knife. He could feel his heart pounding in his chest, the adrenaline surging through his veins. The world seemed to slow down around him, everything becoming sharper, more intense. The clerk finally looked up, sensing something off. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice cautious. For a moment, Kazuki hesitated, his breath hitched, his hand trembling. But then, Itako's voice cut through the noise in his head, soft and insistent. "Do it." With a sudden violent motion, Kazuki lunged forward, the blade flashing under the fluorescent light. The clerk's eyes widened in shock, his hands coming up too late to defend himself. The knife plunged into his chest with a sickening sound, the warmth of blood spreading across Kazuki's hand. The man crumpled to the ground, gasping, his eyes locked on Kazuki's, pleading, terrified, confused. Kazuki stood over him, the knife still in his hand, his mind a blur. This wasn't real. It couldn't be real. And yet, the man's body lay before him, lifeless, the life draining from his eyes. "Good." Itako's voice purred through the earpiece. "Now they'll see you. Now you're someone." Kazuki stumbled back, his breathing ragged, his heart pounding in his ears. He felt sick, dizzy, but also alive. The isolation, the years of being invisible, all of it seemed to fall away in that moment. He had done something. He had acted. But as he turned to leave the store, wiping the blood from his hands onto his pants, a new thought gripped him, colder than the fear he had felt before. He was no longer invisible. The police would come. They would investigate, and they would find him. Kazuki fled into the night, the city stretched out before him like a labyrinth. But even as he ran, the weight of what he had done began to settle on his chest. There was no turning back now. The cat-and-mouse game had begun. Kazuki was no longer just a Hikikomori. He had become something else entirely. But in the shadows, Itako watched. They had unleashed a storm, and they were not done with Kazuki yet. "You've started a fire. Let it burn." Kazuki's throat tightened. He wanted to reply, to ask what that meant, to demand answers. But a soft knock at his door made him freeze. He hadn't had a visitor in years. No one knew he was here. His blood turned to ice in his veins. Another knock, louder this time, more insistent. Kazuki's breath caught in his throat. Had the police already found him? He backed away from the door, his mind racing through impossible scenarios. But something told him this wasn't the police. This was something worse. Who is it?" His voice was barely more than a whisper, but it was all he could manage. There was no response, just a creak of the floorboards outside his door as someone shifted their weight. Then, silence. Kazuki's heart hammered in his chest. His eyes darted to the only window in the room, but they were 4 stories up. No way out that way. He crept toward the door, placing his ear against it, trying to hear any movement. Nothing. Slowly, with trembling hands, he turned the lock and cracked the door open. The hallway outside was empty, just the dim, flickering light overhead and the musty scent of old wood. He let out a shaky breath, relief washing over him for the briefest moment. He was imagining things. The stress, the guilt, it was playing tricks on his mind. But as he turned to close the door, he noticed something. A small, folded piece of paper that had been slipped under the doorframe. Hesitating only for a moment, Kazuki bent down and picked it up. His fingers fumbled with it as he unfolded the note. The handwriting was elegant, almost too neat, as if drawn with careful precision. "Are you ready for what comes next?" Kazuki's skin prickled with a cold sweat. His mind raced, trying to piece together who could have left this, how they could have known where he lived. His phone buzzed again, another message from Itako. "The game begins now. You're not alone anymore." Kazuki sank to the floor, the note still clutched in his hand. He couldn't tell if he was shaking from fear or anticipation. He had never felt so exposed, so vulnerable, and yet there was a part of him, a dark, twisted part, that wanted to see what came next. Days passed, and Kazuki's life began to spiral further into chaos. He didn't dare leave the apartment again, not after the murder, not after that note. But the messages from Itako didn't stop, each one more cryptic than the last, pushing him to the edge. Each night, the knocks returned, always at the same time. But when he opened the door, no one was there. Only another note, another taunt, another promise. "You're a ghost now, but the world is watching." Kazuki became consumed by paranoia. His once disheveled room now looked worse, a chaotic reflection of his crumbling mind. The curtains were drawn, shutting out the world, and the smell of rotting food lingered in the air. He barely slept, haunted by nightmares of the man he had killed, of the police dragging him out of his apartment, of Itako's eyes watching him from the shadows. Then came the breaking point. One night, as Kazuki sat huddled in a corner, his phone vibrated again. Another message from Itako, but this one was different. "You're not safe there anymore. Run." Kazuki stared at the message, his pulse quickening. His gaze shot to the door, half expecting to hear the familiar knock. But instead, he heard footsteps. Heavy, deliberate footsteps, coming from down the hallway. Panic surged through him. This wasn't like the other nights. This time, someone was really coming. The footsteps stopped just outside the door. He heard a soft click, the unmistakable sound of a key sliding into the lock. Kazuki scrambled to his feet, his mind racing. He had no plan, no idea what to do. The door creaked open slowly, casting a sliver of light across the filthy floor. Kazuki backed into the far corner of the room, his eyes wide with terror. And then, a figure stepped inside. It wasn't Itako. It wasn't anyone he recognized. The man who stood in the doorway was tall, dressed in a plain black suit, his expression unreadable. He looked around the room, taking in the mess, the squalor, the broken man trembling in the corner. Kazuki's breath hitched, his body frozen with fear. The man stepped forward, his movements slow, deliberate. "You're coming with me," the man said, his voice calm, almost gentle. Kazuki shook his head, backing further into the corner. No, I didn't..." But the man wasn't listening. He reached into his jacket, pulling out something small and metallic. It took Kazuki a moment to realize it. A badge. Police. Before Kazuki could react, the two men appeared in the doorway, both dressed in black, both wearing the same blank expressions. Kazuki's world closed in around him. The room, once a sanctuary, now felt like a prison. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. The man in the suit stepped closer, his shadow falling over Kazuki. "It's over." Kazuki's vision blurred, the room spinning around him. Itako had promised him freedom, escape, but there was no escape. There never was. As the officers closed in, Kazuki's phone buzzed one last time. He glanced at the screen, his heart sinking as he read the final message from Itako. Checkmate. His mind was a tempest of confusion, fear, and rage, all swirling together in a storm he couldn't control. The lead officer, the man in the black suit with cold, expressionless eyes, gripped his arm with a force that made his bones ache. "It's over, Kazuki," the officer said again, his voice eerily calm. Kazuki's mind whirled with 1,000 questions, but none of them formed into words. His lips moved soundlessly as he struggled to understand how it had come to this. Had Itako betrayed him? Was this all part of some twisted game? And what was the meaning of checkmate? The officers cuffed him, the cold metal biting into his wrists, and they led him out of the apartment. His footsteps felt heavy, as though the floor was dragging him down. The narrow, dim hallway of his building seemed impossibly long, stretching out into a tunnel with no end in sight. The fluorescent lights flickered above, casting everything in a sickly pale hue. Kazuki stumbled forward, his head hung low, but something gnawed at him. Something more than just a fear of the police, or the consequence of what he had done. It was an eerie feeling, as though something was still watching him, lurking just out of sight. The sensation sent chills down his spine. The officers guided him down the stairs and out into the alley behind the building. Night had fallen, the moon thin, sickle-like, crescent above the towering skyscrapers of Tokyo. The alley was bathed in shadows, a forgotten, lifeless corner of the city. As they led him toward a waiting police car, Kazuki's gaze darted around the darkened street, his paranoia growing stronger with every step. The officer in the suit stopped behind the car, gripping Kazuki's arm tighter. "You've caused quite a stir," he said in a low voice, his eyes locking onto Kazuki's. "But it's over now. We know everything." Kazuki blinked, the words sinking into him like lead weights. They know everything? How? He had been so careful. Even Itako's messages were cryptic, barely leaving a trail. His mind scrambled for answers, for some explanation, but then it hit him. A single terrifying thought. What if they were never trying to hide? What if the game was rigged from the start? Kazuki's breath quickened, panic flooding his veins. "What do you mean, everything?" Kazuki stammered. The officer's lips twitched, forming a thin smile, an expression that sent an icy shiver down Kazuki's spine. "You'll see soon enough." Before Kazuki could ask more, the officer shoved him into the back seat of the police car. The door slammed shut, and Kazuki was left in darkness. The world outside the tinted windows distorted and surreal. The officers climbed into the front seats, their voices low as they exchanged words Kazuki couldn't hear. The car pulled away from the alley, merging into the streets of Tokyo. Kazuki pressed his head against the window, watching the city blur by in streaks of lights and shadows. His heart hammered in his chest, his mind racing with 1,000 scenarios, each one more nightmarish than the last. Then, something caught his eye. A figure, standing in the shadows of the side street they passed, dressed in black, face obscured by a hood, watching him. Itako. Kazuki's blood ran cold, his pulse surged as he craned his neck, trying to catch another glimpse, but the car had already sped past, and the figure was swallowed by the night. Had he imagined it? Was it just a trick of his mind, shattered by days of paranoia and fear? But deep down, Kazuki knew it was them. Itako was still out there, watching, pulling the strings. The car turned sharply, and Kazuki realized they weren't heading to the police station. They were leaving the city, moving to the quieter outskirts, where the skyscrapers thinned into residential buildings and narrow roads lined with dark trees. The urban glow of Tokyo faded behind them, and Kazuki's stomach twisted with unease. "Where are we going?" Kazuki asked, his voice trembling. Neither of the officers responded. The man in the suit glanced at him in the rearview mirror, his cold eyes locked onto Kazuki's for a moment before looking away. Kazuki's pulse quickened. Something was wrong. This wasn't standard procedure. He wasn't being taken to a police station. His mind raced with thoughts of escape, but the cuffs around his wrists held him firmly in place. The car finally pulled off the main road onto a narrow dirt path, flanked by trees that loomed tall and dark, like ancient sentinels. Kazuki's heart pounded in his chest as the car rolled deeper into the forest, the headlights barely cutting through the thick, oppressive darkness. The vehicle came to a stop in front of an old, decrepit building. A forgotten structure that looked more like a relic of some past era than anything that belonged in the modern world. It was a long-abandoned shrine, the wood rotting and the roof caved in at parts, its once sacred grounds now overgrown with weeds and vines. The officers stepped outside of the car, and Kazuki's panic reached a fever pitch. "Where are you taking me?" he shouted, his voice cracking with fear. The man in the suit opened the door, gripping Kazuki's arm tightly as he pulled him from the car. "Quiet," he said coldly. You'll understand soon enough." Kazuki struggled, but the man's grip was iron, and he was forced forward, his feet dragging across the uneven ground. They led him through the crumbling archway of the shrine, deeper into the overgrown courtyard, where the air was thick with the scent of damp earth and decay. The silence was suffocating, broken only by the rustle of leaves in the wind. At the center of the courtyard stood a single stone altar, ancient and withered, stained with the marks of time. The officers brought him to it, forcing him to his knees before the altar, the cold stone pressing against his skin. Kazuki's mind was spinning, his heart racing. He had no idea what was happening, but every fiber of his being screamed that this was wrong, terribly wrong. He opened his mouth to shout, to demand answers, but a new voice, deep and unfamiliar, echoed through the darkness. "Welcome, Kazuki." The voice sent a chill down his spine, and Kazuki looked up, his eyes widening in terror. From the shadows behind the altar, a figure emerged, a man, tall and imposing, dressed in a dark traditional robe. His face was obscured by an intricately carved mask, its features twisted and demonic, as if mocking the very concept of humanity. The man stepped forward, his presence radiating an unnatural authority, his every movement deliberate and controlled. Kazuki's blood turned to ice. Who are you?" he stammered, his voice barely more than a whisper. The masked man tilted his head slightly, as if amused by the question. "I am the one who sees what others do not," he said softly, his voice like the rustling of dead leaves. "And I have been watching you for a very long time, Kazuki." Kazuki's heart thudded in his chest. What? What do you want?" The man reached out, placing a hand on Kazuki's head, the touch cold and heavy, like the weight of 1,000 unspoken secrets. "You're part of something far greater than you realize," the man whispered, his voice slipping into Kazuki's mind like a poison. "You've already begun the ritual. Itako was merely the catalyst." Kazuki's eyes widened. The pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place, but the picture they formed was more horrifying than he ever could have imagined. This was never about rebellion, about escaping society's grip. This was about something darker, something ancient. He was part of a ritual, a sacrifice, and he hadn't even realized it. The masked man stepped back, raising his hands to the sky. The wind picked up, swirling around them, carrying with it a low, haunting hum that seemed to come from the earth itself. The officers stood still, their expressions blank, their roles in the dark ceremony clear now. Kazuki tried to move, tried to flee, but his body wouldn't obey. His muscles were frozen, his mind trapped in a fog of terror. The ground beneath him began to tremble, the air thickening with an oppressive force that pressed down on him, suffocating him. The masked man's voice rose, chanting in a language Kazuki didn't understand. But the words sent shivers through his very soul. The altar beneath him began to glow faintly, pulsing with a sickly, otherworldly light. Kazuki's eyes darted around wildly, searching for a way out, for any sign of hope. But then, as if in an answer to his silent pleas, he saw movement at the edge of the shrine grounds. A figure, cloaked in black, stepping out from the shadows. Itako. Their hood was down, revealing a face Kazuki had never seen, but somehow recognized. Itako was neither male nor female, neither young nor old. A face that seemed to shift and blur, as though it belonged to no one and everyone at once. "It's time," Itako said softly, the voice cutting through the chaos like a blade. The masked man turned to face Itako, his chant faltering. "You? What are you doing here?" Itako smiled, a slow, knowing smile. "You've miscalculated, old friend. Kazuki isn't yours to claim." Kazuki's heart leapt in his chest. "What's happening?" he cried, his voice breaking. Itako stepped closer, their eyes never leaving the masked man. "You were never a pawn, Kazuki. You were the key." With a wave of their hand, the wind died down, the oppressive force lifting. The glowing light from the altar flickered and then went out. The masked man staggered back, fury and confusion wearing in his eyes. "What have you done?" he spat, his voice filled with venom. Itako's smile widened. "The game was never yours to win." In that moment, Kazuki felt the invisible chains holding him break. He scrambled to his feet, his breath ragged, his mind still reeling. Itako turned to him, their expressions softening. You've been through enough, Kazuki. It's time to end this. With a final deliberate motion, Itako raised their hand, and the world around them seemed to bend, reality warping and twisting. The masked man screamed, his body disintegrating into nothingness as the power of the ritual collapsed in around him. And then, silence. The shrine, the forest, the officers. Everything was gone. Kazuki stood alone in the middle of an empty street, the city lights of Tokyo glowing softly in the distance. It was over. He turned slowly, his eyes searching the shadows, but Itako was gone. Only their final words echoed in his mind. The game was never about escaping. It was about choosing your own fate. Kazuki stood there, trembling as the realization washed over him. He was free. But the price of his freedom was a secret he would carry for the rest of his life. And somewhere in the dark corners of Tokyo, Itako was still watching him.